Here locally, there are sound barriers along the interstate. There are also some along New Circle near Versailles Road. The Transportation Cabinet says there are two ways noise barriers are considered to run next to a road. The first is a federally funded road project that adds lanes or capacity. Whenever those happen, KYTC says measurements are taken to identify a feasible and reasonable noise abatement measure. That's usually sound barriers. Quote, a noise barrier is considered feasible if it would provide a substantial noise reduction, 5 decibels or more, for 3 or more impacted receptors. It would not pose safety or maintenance problems. There are also cost considerations the project would have to meet. The second way those barriers go up would be if lawmakers in Frankfort wanted it to happen. Quote, sound and wall barrier projects can be identified and funded by the General Assembly as part of the biennial highway plan and do not require any reasonable or feasible analysis. But they also note that historically more projects are listed in the highway plan than funds are available. If you have a good question, just email us. Goodquestion@WKYT.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.